My name is Mike Petrilli, and it's a real honor to be with you this morning. Big thank you to L&D and to the university for inviting me to speak today and to visit your beautiful country, my first time in Chile and Santiago. I understand it is not always raining here in Chile, so I'll have to come back when it is sunny. I also want to thank you for having this translation services here. My two sons have been teasing me. They keep saying, "Are you sure, Dad, that they don't expect you to speak in Spanish?" And I was, "Oh, no, they don't." And then every once in a while I had a little bit of nervousness that, I never actually asked them. But you may know there are some things the United States education system does fairly well. Teaching foreign languages is not one of them. I took 4 years of Spanish. I can speak almost nothing. So again, appreciate you translating today. I've now been in Santiago for, about 36 hours, and I've already learned quite a bit. Before coming here, I think like a lot of Americans and like a lot of international education experts, I knew about the school choice system that you've had here in Chile. You're famous for that for the last 4 decades. What I didn't know was about the reforms from about 10 years ago with the Quality Assurance Agency. And with this attempt to try to bring in more measurement and accountability into your education system. And I've really been impressed to learn about the work that you've done. And as I'll talk about today, I think in many respects, you are ahead of where we are in the United States on those fronts. I also understand, though, that you're having a big debate about whether or not to keep some of these elements of accountability and measurement going forward. And so I'm going to talk about today what I'm calling the accountability imperative, why it's essential for Chile not to abandon its efforts to bring greater accountability into the education system. In many respects, over the last decade, the United States, we have abandoned our efforts to hold schools accountable, and that's been a big mistake, and I'm going to talk about that as well. So I'm going to talk about 6 big topics over the next hour. By the way, a whole hour. You must have much better attention span here in Chile than we have in the United States. In the US, everybody's watching TikTok and YouTube all the time, and so, we can't pay attention for very long at all, but very impressive here. So 6 big topics. The first is why accountability is an imperative, not just in schools, but in all organizations. Second of all, the importance of academic skills for individuals and countries' futures. Then a little bit about how results-based accountability works in the United States, overall for our public education system, but also in our charter schools sector. Next, the evidence of the effectiveness of accountability systems in driving greater student learning in the United States, but also in Chile, based on a brand new study here. Fifth, the promise that greater accountability for results can come with greater autonomy for educators. And finally, some of the legitimate concerns that educators have about testing and accountability systems. And we'll talk about worries about narrowing the curriculum or teaching to the test. Also, this notion that it's just not fair to hold educators accountable for so many things that are outside of their control. And we'll dig into that also. Okay, so that's the plan for today. So let's start here with this notion that accountability is an imperative. Now, I don't know how it is here in Chile, but in the United States, when we poll people about the idea of accountability in education, we use that word is actually very popular. And I think it's because in the United States, we talk about holding institutions accountable all the time. We say that politicians should be held accountable for living up to their promises or doing right by the people, that big businesses should be held accountable, that charities should be held accountable. A lot of times what we mean is that if somebody has partaken in illegal behavior or done something kind of shady, they should be held accountable. A lot of talk right now about holding a certain former president accountable for trying to steal an election in the United States. So people like the general notion of holding people accountable. But we also mean by accountability that we need to have external pressure on organizations. External pressure that encourages organizations in any sector to try to focus on being well-run, putting the needs of their customers or their clients or their stakeholders above the needs of the owners or the people who work in the organization. Now, we know that in the private sector, if it's working well, that competition, market forces, that's supposed to help hold organizations accountable. If you are not doing a good job as a private company, some other company is going to come in, take your customers, take your market share. That puts pressure on you to be as well run as possible. It also means that you've got to treat your staff well. Because one thing we know about employees in this economy, where well-trained, well-educated, highly qualified people have a lot of options, is we all want to work at places that are successful. We want to go into work every day and have success. And so we want to go to organizations that are well-run. Now, in the public sector, sometimes we have some challenges about how to make sure that those institutions can be held accountable. There's been a lot of effort, I know, here in Chile, in the United States. Groups like L&D have promoted this over the years to bring in market forces into government. And in education here, your system of the demand-side subsidies, the vouchers, or charter schools, is a great example of that, of trying to make sure that there is some effort to give parents choices and real power in the system. But in my opinion, even that is not enough. That public institutions also have to be held accountable for achieving the results that the public demands. And so we've gotten better at this over the years, I would say. A lot of this is about being very clear about what the goals are that we want public agencies to achieve, measuring how they're doing against those goals, holding their leaders accountable for meeting those targets. And that, again, is certainly the case in public education. We know that in education, we support education publicly with public tax dollars because we know that we all benefit when we have more children doing well, learning more, going on to support the economy and our democracies. And so it's an important public investment. But we also know that it has great benefits for private individuals as well. That's why as parents, as moms and dads, we worry a lot about whether our own kids are getting a good education. We know that that means they're going to go on and be able to do well in life, to get a good job, and to succeed. So it's a public good, it's also a private good. So in Chile, you've got this system of school choice. That's super helpful to make sure that parents have some power. And we have more and more of that in the United States as well. But we've certainly learned in the United States that it's still not enough to ensure quality education. We have places where parents are choosing schools, and some of those schools are not very good. In some cases, the schools they're choosing are terrible. Now, when you try to understand why, and you survey parents and you dig into it, you usually find that the parents are choosing among the best options they have, but that especially in some of our poorer neighborhoods, none of the options are very good. So they may be choosing the best option, but the options are still low quality. And so what we learn is that it's not enough to give parents choice. We also have to make sure that the choices are good. You can't just pay attention to the demand side. You have to pay attention to the supply side. And how do we make sure that if there's neighborhoods without good quality schools, we have some system to fix that and to bring new schools into existence. And again, having an accountability system where we can measure, we know how schools are performing, where we can close down bad schools when necessary, replace them with good schools, all of that can make a big difference. And again, it is a way to also make sure that the people working in schools, our educators, have options to go to schools that themselves are high performing and where they can do their best work. We have, and I understand that you do too, a real challenge right now in attracting young people into teaching. We have a lot of shortages, and certainly in America, where we have a very low unemployment rate right now, is tougher than ever to get people to come into teaching. And we also have a problem in getting people to stay in teaching. And pay is part of the issue, although we've made some progress on that. And when we ask people, why are you leaving teaching? The number one reason that they say is because they don't feel successful, right? It's not the pay necessarily. It's not even the working conditions necessarily. It's the feeling that they come in every day, they're trying hard, they're working hard, but they're not seeing results. The kids aren't making that much progress, and it's because they're working inside schools that are not set up to help them succeed. They don't have the training, they don't have the know-how, they don't have the support from their principals in order to help kids be successful. And so, one of the goals of accountability is to make sure that we actually have schools where teachers can do their best work. So that is the imperative at the end of the day, creating excellent schools full of teachers and other educators with the tools and support to be successful, and students who make big gains in learning every year, okay, gains in learning. You know, another part of the promise here, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later, is the hope that if we hold educators accountable for results, then we don't have to try to ask them to follow all kinds of rules and regulations. Because at the end of the day, the public, the taxpayer, you know, they're not going to be okay with education systems spending all this money and not having any accountability, right? So, because that's just not an option, to spend money and have zero kinds of accountability, because over time, if you do that, we know what'll happen, right? That money will be wasted, people will hire their friends and family to work in their schools instead of the best people. You'll have schools that are not where they need to be. That happens in any sector. If you don't focus on results, what's the alternative? Well, it's to tell people to just follow these rules, follow these regulations, compliance, fill out these forms, make sure that you do exactly what we tell you to do. And we know that's not the way to get to excellent schools either. Now, I want to be clear. In the United States, in Chile, anywhere, having accountability, measurement, assessment, that's not going to solve all of our problems, right? That's only one small piece of it. We also need to get everything else right. We need to make sure that there's ample funding and that it's going to the right places. We have to make sure that we do a great job training new leaders and that they have the knowledge and skills to be successful. We need to go in and make sure we're using great curriculum. All of the details of how we run excellent schools, of course, that all matters. But I would argue that accountability then, it's necessary but not sufficient. But it is necessary. It's one of those key ingredients that we need to have. Okay, so let's dig in now about academic skills and knowledge. In the United States, a lot of the pushback when it comes to testing and accountability, and to be clear, there is a lot of pushback, it comes from this idea that test scores, they just don't measure what's most important, right? Now, I said earlier that accountability in education is popular. If you'd poll the public, that's true. But if you poll about testing in education, it's very unpopular, especially among teachers, but among parents as well. So it's interesting. We want accountability. We don't love testing. That's a challenge, right? But a lot of those reasons people don't like testing, it's understandable. And one of it is this idea that, again, okay, maybe you can measure reading skills, you can measure math skills, maybe history and science, but that's not all that matters to people's future. And of course, that is true. There's some truth to that, right? When you have an agency like, understand, your quality assurance agency, and you can actually go in and visit schools, you can go in and look at a much broader set of indicators to determine whether a school is high quality. And we know that parents are looking at a much broader set of indicators than test scores. We know that teachers course care more. You can go in, you can say, okay, are the facilities, are they safe and orderly and well maintained? Is there a culture of respect for everybody involved? Is there strong communication in the parties? Do the teachers and students have the books and the technology and other tools that they need? But if you go into a school and you say it's a beautiful building, it's got a welcoming culture, the students are happy, it's still, I would argue, not a high quality school if not much learning is happening, right? It can have all of the trappings of a great school, but if kids aren't making much progress in basic academic skills from year to year, that can't be considered a high quality school. We need the measurement to fill out the picture. Now, again, these aren't the only skills that matter. Reading, mathematics, knowledge of history, science. I understand there's been a lot of talk here, as in the United States, about social and emotional skills. Super important. How to cooperate with one another, how to persevere in the face of challenges or to solve problems, how to be creative. And I understand that you've done a lot of good work here to make sure that measuring those skills is a part of the way that you classify schools. That's a part of your accountability system. You know, there's been a lot of talk about that in the United States, but we haven't actually made much progress on that front in putting those kinds of indicators in place. And it's actually, in some ways, a shame. A long time ago, when I worked at the U.S. Department of Education, we would have visitors from overseas come and visit us, and they'd always want to know. They wouldn't ask us about how we did math, for example, because everybody knows we're actually pretty bad at teaching math in the United States. But they would say, how is it that you keep creating these innovative people? We want to have the next Steve Jobs. We want to have the next Bill Gates. How do you end up, your Silicon Valley, you end up having all these innovative entrepreneurial people? And they would ask us, it must be something about the way that you're teaching inside your classroom. And what we would always say is, look, it's not what's happening during the school day in America. It's actually our secret sauce is what we do after school. At our schools, we have kids playing sports all the time. We have theater, we have music, we have arts, we have student council, we have all these activities, it's extracurricular activities, where kids can go and really find themselves, find their identity, find out what they're good at, learn to work in teams, be creative, be a leader. That's our secret sauce. That, as well as our broader culture, where we encourage young people to push boundaries and to be entrepreneurial. That's our secret sauce. That's the stuff that we talk about when we say social and emotional skills and those other things beyond academics that really matter. So it does matter, right? But what I want to show you is that it matters, but that doesn't take the place of the reading and the math and those basic skills. You need to have both. And if our schools somehow did a great job teaching the social and emotional stuff, but didn't teach kids how to read or do math, we still would not be where we need to be. It would not help kids actually go on to succeed in the labor market. It would not help our countries actually go on to show strong economic growth. You've got to do these pieces. So let's dig in on that, on the evidence when it comes to that. So again, the basic point here is that if schools can help students learn more than they otherwise would, we're going to help them earn more than they otherwise would as adults. Okay? Now, there's a lot of evidence on this. And some of the basic science on this comes from Nobel Prize-winning economist James Heckman and his colleagues. They've done studies over the years finding that higher test scores are related to better outcomes in terms of employment, choice of occupation, work experience. Kids who learn more end up going on to get better jobs. This is not rocket science, right? We're not too surprised about that. And kids who don't go on to learn more have these riskier behaviors. Again, at least in the United States. Teenage pregnancy, smoking, troubles with criminal activity. Another study more recently by Daejun Lin and his colleagues finds that cognitive skills at the end of high school are associated with rising labor market returns as people age. So it's not just going to help somebody get a better job, their first job out of high school or out of college. It's actually the gift that keeps on giving. They're going to keep on making more progress as they get older into their careers if they've learned more in school. Okay? Now, these studies, they all try to control for background factors, socioeconomic factors, race in America, because of course we know that test scores are highly correlated with socioeconomic background, right? That affluent kids coming from well-educated, stable families tend to score higher than kids who are coming from poverty. And that you can see that as soon as you can look at the tests. When kids are 2, 3, 4 years old, you can see that already, okay? So studies like this try to control for those factors in the same way that your classification system has socioeconomic controls, right? But you still worry that, well, maybe some of this is measuring not so much the learning in reading or in math. Maybe it's the social and emotional stuff. Maybe kids who have more grit, they do get better test scores and they also go on and do better in the workplace. Maybe there's something we're not measuring. So, because we know correlation is not causation, right? So some of the other studies, quasi-experimental studies, have allowed us to get past some of those issues and be able to really hone in on the impact of the skills, the academic skills that we care about. One of the most famous studies on this front is by Raj Chetty and his peers. It came out probably 10 years ago, and it showed that students with more effective teachers went on to earn more as adults than those with less effective teachers. And the key here for our point is that the way they measured teacher effectiveness was whether or not teachers helped kids learn more over the course of the year. So the relationship was, if you go in, you're lucky to have a great teacher, you learn more under that great teacher than your similar peers. 10, 15 years later, when you're in the labor market, you earn more than those very similar peers, right? These test scores are measuring things that really matter, okay? Another study by Will Dobby, Roland Fryer, looked at our charter schools. And this was a randomized experiment. Kids that wanted to get into the charter school and did, others that didn't because they lost the lottery. Very, exact same population of kids. They showed that these charter schools, this was in Boston, increased test scores, right? And then later also increased college attendance and decreased the likelihood of all kinds of risky behaviors, including problems with the law. So again, improve student learning, and you have these real impacts on outcomes. Another one, this one more coming from the left, looked at the impact of school funding. We've had all these debates, I'm sure you have as well, over school funding over the years. In America, a lot of our school funding increases have come because of lawsuits at the state level. They were able to use these state lawsuits as a bit of a random kind of natural experiment to see what happens when the school funding all of a sudden increased dramatically. They were able to find that, yes, lo and behold, that did increase test scores, especially for the lowest performing kids and lowest income kids. That's not too surprising, but it's important. But also, if you follow those kids years later, they also do better as adults than they otherwise would. Okay? So again, improve learning, get better outcomes as results. And another one by Susan Dynarski and colleagues about a class size reduction project. Again, same thing. Reduce class size in the early grades, boost test scores, boost long-term outcomes. Oh, and finally, a brand new one out of Massachusetts, where they were able to look at all the high schools in the state of Massachusetts, find ones where kids tended to learn more over the course of high school, right? And lo and behold, those kids that were lucky enough to go to those high schools compared to very similar peers earned 13% more as adults in their early 20s than otherwise. So there is something going on. So when people say that these test scores don't matter, they measure things that don't matter, kids are not a test score, of course kids are not a test score, right? But these test scores measure stuff that does matter for kids' future success, okay? And that should make us more comfortable with making sure that we have measurement and accountability that involve these test scores, okay? Now that's for individual kids. What about for countries as a whole? I understand that Eric Hanushek, a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution, spoke at this conference a few years ago. He's probably one of the most famous scholars who looks at these relationships. And what he has found, quite compellingly, is that long-run growth in gross domestic product is largely determined by the skills of a nation's population, right? And these can be measured by standardized tests of cognitive achievement, okay? People have been looking at this question for a long time. And it used to be that they would look and say, okay, well, if you increase the number of kids who graduate from high school or graduate from college, does that help a country grow their economy? And there was not a strong relationship. It turns out what matters is not getting kids to be in school longer. What matters is whether they learn more when they're there, right? So actually, if you look at math test scores, there you see the relationship. And that they do these studies in a way that they're pretty sure it's the skills, it's the test scores, the skills measured by the test scores that are driving economic growth, not the other way around, okay? And when you look at this, it looks something like this chart. I tried to circle Chile in that red. I think you're grouped there. I'm not sure, well, it's hard to see, but that is Chile there. In some respects, you're where you would be expected to be. What this is showing is that based on your test scores on the international assessments, you've got the kind of economic growth that you could expect. But if you want to move up that line, if you want to have greater economic growth, you've got to have stronger performance as measured by these assessments, okay? Now, it's not a perfect relationship. You can see where the United States is. We have stronger economic growth than we do education results, right? We've got a lot of advantages that help us have a strong economy. Our education system is not one of them, at least our K-12 system. Our higher education system is one of those factors, right, and some of the other things. But this is hugely important, right, that if Chile wants to continue to make progress, that this is the path. This is the path. And so, again, test scores don't measure everything, but they measure something very important, okay? Now, let me also just say, it's important, and I understand educators have this feeling all the time, that they feel like we are asking them sometimes to do the impossible, right? We are telling them that it's all on your shoulders. And so, I mean, I just said, right, you want to improve your economy in Chile, you've got to boost these test scores. Well, that sounds like a pudding, right? And it's not fair to ask educators to do everything. We also know that there's huge factors outside of educators' control that matter a lot. If kids are coming to school from poverty, if they're hungry, if they're not getting what they need at home, right, that makes teachers' jobs a lot harder. Okay? So we can't ask schools to do it all. But the question is, are schools doing all they can? And again, getting back to this notion of helping kids make as much progress from one year to the next, helping kids come as close as they can to fulfilling their potential, right? That doesn't mean we're asking them to work miracles, but that we are asking them day to day to help get closer to that goal. Okay, so how do these things work in the United States? The organizers asked me to come and help explain how some of these systems work, to compare them a little bit to how the Quality Assurance Agency and now your classification system work here. So we'll talk about how this works for our traditional public schools and then for our charter schools. So you've probably all heard of the No Child Left Behind Act. Yes, is that familiar? That was in place from 2002 until 2015. Okay, so 13 years. So a whole generation of kids that came in kindergarten when in 2002 would have been graduating high school around the time that it ended. And that law was quite prescriptive. It actually had a much stronger federal government role than we'd ever had before. It required every state in the country to test every student in every grade, grades 3 through 8, in reading and in math. And then it had a very specific way to classify schools based on mostly how they did on those tests. It also had this interesting element where it said you had to make sure that all of the subgroups of kids were meeting goals, not just the averages. And the notion here was that if you were a school that serves, say, half white kids, half black kids, in America, black students tend to perform much lower than white students because of our history of slavery and everything else. You can't be considered a good school if your white students are doing well, but your black students are doing poorly. Right? That was a big focus there. Same thing with students still learning English or with students with disabilities. And then there was a set of very clear expectations on what was supposed to happen if schools were not meeting these goals, including, it could include that the states were supposed to go in, intervene, if that didn't work, actually shut down schools. Now, a lot of that didn't happen, right? It was very rare for us to actually go in and shut down schools because of their performance. Though, at the same time the law was rolling out, we had a big increase in the number of kids going to charter schools. We also had some cities that were losing population. And so they did need to close schools. There weren't enough kids to go to the traditional public schools. And there were places that chose to close the lowest performing schools. So the combination of these policies did result in quite a few of the worst schools going away. And that there's good evidence that that did help improve student performance. Kids did better when they ended up in better schools than the ones that had been closed. But it was a little bit indirect. Then in 2015, Congress passed the Every Student Succeeds Act. In some ways, it repealed parts of No Child Left Behind, but it did keep parts of it in place. We still have annual tests in reading and math in grades 3 through 8. Okay, so when you think there's a lot of testing in Chile, okay, you got nothing on us. All right, every year from grades 3 through 8, and actually once in high school as well. Okay, it is now up to each state, though, to determine how schools are rated, how to do, as you call it, school classifications, and what they look like. So some states, like Florida, have A to F grades. Schools can get an A, a B, C, D, F. Parents are familiar with these grades. They know what that means. In other places, like Ohio, we have a 0 to 5 rating, kind of like you see on a phone on a lot of the apps. Again, easy to use. But there's other states, like California, where they don't rate schools at all. They just have to release the data about how kids are doing, in terms of overall and in these subgroups, and then people can try to make sense of it as they can. There was also a big push, as you've had, to say, hey, we should measure things other than test scores. We should try to measure these social and emotional skills. And there's been a little bit of progress on that, but for the most part, not too much. There's been a lot of nervousness about using surveys, either kids or teachers or parents for these kinds of purposes to link it to high stakes accountability. So for the most part, we're still very focused on test scores, also attendance rates, high school graduation rates is a piece of it as well. Oh, thank you. And then in terms of low-performing schools, there's not as much requirements as they're used to. It's really, again, up to the states about what to do. They're supposed to do something if a school is chronically low-performing. The way the timing worked, this was starting to kick in, and then we had the pandemic, and so there hasn't been much of that yet. And it really varies by states. There are still a few states, like Florida, Texas, Louisiana, where they try to go in and really turn around schools, but there's other places where they're really not doing much of anything. Okay, so when you look at that big picture, again, I would say that Chile is ahead of where a lot of American states are now, where there's not much accountability. Maybe a few states are where you are as well. Okay, and you know, this, especially when it comes to this possibility here, that if schools get, what is it called, insufficient is the lowest classification, that they can lose their recognition, right? And that could put them out of business, right? Now, I understand that hasn't happened yet, but that it could is important. Let me also just mention charter schools in the United States. I know that you have, again, these schools that are the private schools getting vouchers, and I don't know if you sometimes call them charter schools or subsidized schools. Okay, you call them subsidized schools. So kind of similar to our charter schools. In our schools, they are public schools. Okay, they're open to everybody. They can't have selective admissions. They can't teach religion. That's one rule that we've got there. They can't charge tuition. So again, they're free. And I understand that's how it is now with your subsidized schools as well. You can't charge more than what the voucher is worth. And you can't go over, right? You can't, right. And then that you've got, and then the other idea is they're really supposed to have greater autonomy than traditional public schools. And that was the notion, is we're going to say, hey, we're going to really hold these schools accountable. That's by this charter. The charter is a contract between the school and a public agency. And they say, here, we're going to promise these results in terms of test scores and other measurements. If we get these results, we get to stay open. If we don't, then we can be closed. But in return, really much more freedom around how they run day to day. It also is the case that most are not unionized. A few are, but most are not, and that allows for lots more flexibility than in the traditional public schools. Okay? All right, so, and again, in the charter school sector, I would say that is where we have seen real accountability. It is quite common, actually, for charter schools to be shut down for low performance. Now, sometimes they close for other reasons. If they're low performing, oftentimes parents figure out that they're low performing and they just leave on their own. And eventually they don't have enough students, they don't have enough funding, and they go out of business. But sometimes the agencies in charge of charter schools do have to close them down or try to do some kind of turnaround. You know, I will say, my institute, we actually are a charter school authorizer in the state of Ohio. That means we oversee about 15 charter schools, and we just recently had to go through the process of threatening to shut down a low-performing school. We were able to manage a turnaround where a different charter school took it over and is now starting fresh. That sort of thing does happen, but we definitely do see school closures come out of it. And what, you know, the evidence I'm going to show you is that this has helped make the charter school sector in the United States much higher performing than traditional public schools. And some of it's just basic math. If you regularly take out the lowest performing schools from the sector, the rest of the sector gets better. But the only way you can do that politically and not have parents especially be angry with you is if you're also creating new schools where parents can send their kids, schools that are better than the ones that you're closing down. Okay, so let's now dig into the evidence on this. You know, I talked earlier about the evidence on testing and the skills that kids are measuring, but what about these efforts to try to hold schools accountable, again, mostly based on those test scores, but other things as well. So do these accountability efforts actually work, and do they make a difference in terms of student learning? And the answer is yes. Now, most of the evidence here is going to come from the United States, but again, we'll get to one study from Chile as well. Now, when people look back, especially on the No Child Left Behind Act, okay, in that period of time when there was probably the greatest amount of accountability, what we can say is that during that time, it was a time when actually the United States made great progress in student achievement, especially for the kids that this was focused on, which were the lowest achieving kids, the lowest income kids, our black students, our Hispanic students, our special education students. They made the greatest gains. Now, and that this continued a long-time trend that, as some scholars, Dan Goldhaber, Michael D'Armond said recently, the long-term gains on our assessment reveal a decades-long narrowing of test score achievement gaps between underserved groups and their more affluent peers. Okay? Let me show you what this looks like. This was an analysis I did a few years ago. What it shows is the proportion of kids who are not meeting basic standards. So in this case, we want that number to go down. Okay, so when you see the numbers going down, that's good news. Okay, we want to have fewer and fewer kids not meeting basic standards. And what we show is that over this time period, we made tremendous progress in getting kids, lowering the number of kids not at basic standards, so more kids meeting those basic standards. You know, it wasn't just about student achievement. This generation of kids who saw this progress, and these were kids who were, you know, in school in the late 90s, early 2000s, as we track them all the way, we see that our high school graduation rates went up dramatically as well. They climbed 15 points on average from the mid-90s to today. We've also now seen college graduation rates go up, especially for Black and Hispanic young adults. For Black students, it's gone up by 15% just in the last 20 years, and for Hispanic students, up by 9%. So, you know, these are big, tangible gains in real-life outcomes. And certainly in the United States, though we can talk about this later, we've had a big debate about, you know, how many kids need to go to college, the benefits of college versus technical training. There's no doubt that kids who go on and complete a college degree do much, much, much better in the workforce. And so the fact that we're getting many more poor kids and Black and Hispanic kids to that level is a huge success, okay? However, the progress did stall out, and that's what this is showing here, is that in the 2010s, even before the pandemic, the progress stalled out. Again, this is a pattern that I understand we can see all over the world in many countries, that we saw this great progress and then it stalled out. My own view is that it had a lot to do with the Great Recession and the economic collapse that happened, that hurt families, that hurt kids, you know, in terms of child poverty rates. In our case, it also hurt school funding. We had a significant cut in school funding. But there's certainly also an argument, and people argue that maybe it was also that this was around the same time that we eased up on accountability, right? That we stopped holding schools accountable, that we stopped threatening them with school closures, you know, that a lot of that went away. And perhaps that's why we see some of these things stalling out even before the pandemic. And then you see with the pandemic, you know, the numbers just going off a cliff, okay? To the degree that we're back to where we started from, right? So much of this progress has been just wiped out by the 2 years of the pandemic. And I think you've got some similar experience, okay? Now again, it's hard to know just looking at the test scores how to explain it. We have debates all the time in America looking at charts like this and trying to say who's got the best hypothesis for what's causing test scores to go up or test scores to go down, right? But you can use some quasi-experimental methods to try to look at whether or not things like accountability can make a difference. And so that's what a bunch of studies have done, including a really important paper by Tom D., Brian Jacob. And what they did is they compared states that had testing and accountability systems already in the late 1990s. These were early adopters of these policies, to those states that didn't adopt those policies until the No Child Left Behind Act made them adopt those policies in the early 2000s, okay? And what they show, and I'm not sure it's easy to see here, but you see those two lines crossing there at the bottom. What they show is that there was a significant impact, that the states that adopted consequential accountability first, right, saw a big jump in student achievement. And then the other states, when they adopted it later, caught up. Okay, and that's pretty strong, compelling evidence that it was the testing and accountability at least had something to do with those rising test scores. Probably doesn't explain all of it, but it did explain a significant amount. They would estimate kids get about a half year of learning more because of this change to accountability, which is a significant impact. And again, we know the impacts were greatest on the lowest achieving kids, the poorest kids, our Black, Hispanic, special education students. Another study looked at these same years and used Catholic schools in America as a bit of a control group. It found that the test scores went up more in the traditional public schools than in the Catholic schools during this time, an indication that it was something about policy, accountability policy, that helped to drive the test scores not just something else going on in the society as a whole. Okay? So it does seem like accountability was working, at least for a while. We're not sure if maybe it stopped working. Maybe you get a big boost, a one-time boost, and then it goes away, or if it was that we eased back on the accountability, and that's why we hit this plateau. Okay? Now, part of an accountability system is to measure, test, classify schools, maybe threaten, some negative consequences. But another part has always been about trying to support also. Send people in and try to help the school improve, right? That's part of the mission of the quality agency, the mission of Aptus and others here in Chile, to go in, try to help schools. So how did that go? Well, in the United States, frankly, we didn't do as much of that as we should have, right? We had mostly focused on accountability. There was not a lot of focus on helping schools figure it out. We had this idea that the problem was will. The problem was whether people had the desire to make changes enough. Whereas it turns out that, yes, that's part of it, to overcome some of the resistance to change, but also what matters is skill. And that there were a lot of schools where they suddenly felt pressure and they didn't know what to do. They wanted to raise test scores. They wanted to help kids do better in reading and math. They didn't know what to do. They didn't know what curriculum to adopt. They didn't. So under President Obama, remember, No Child Left Behind started under Bush. President Obama came in, kept No Child Left Behind, but added to it a big focus on a new influx of money, up to $7 billion over a few years, into the lowest performing schools to try to give them more help and assistance to reach these targets. Now, what happened? Well, unfortunately, overall, if you look across the whole country, we didn't see much of any outcomes. It was hard to detect. The money seemed to be spread too wide. And again, there was a lot of focus on helping, but there wasn't much focus on the accountability piece. However, in a few places, and this is in California, they really focused the money on a relatively few schools, okay, sometimes spending up to $1.5 million per school, a huge amount of money, put in a lot of intensive interventions, sent in teams of educators with a lot of expertise, and they were able to get some results in terms of moving the needle on achievement. So it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible, okay? Finally, I want to look at the comparison between our charter school sector and our private schools, okay? As I mentioned, our charter schools, there's a lot of accountability, right? There's a lot of accountability for results. And a very recent study, and a colleague at Hoover did this one, showing that on average now, charter schools are outperforming traditional public schools. And these numbers actually don't look that impressive. This is for overall. If you look at just in our cities, where most of the poorest kids live, the results are dramatically better. That charter schools have something like 2 or 3 months of extra learning every single year compared to traditional public schools, okay? But what's also interesting is that they seem to do much better than our private schools as well, the private schools that now can get school vouchers. I don't want to get too much into this, but we do have in some states a system where private schools, completely private, can get public money for kids' tuition. It's relatively new in a lot of places, but we've got some studies, and the studies there have not been as promising. In fact, there's been more and more evidence that the kids are learning less in private schools than they are in traditional public schools. Studies from Ohio, from Louisiana, showing that result, okay? Well, why might that be? Got a lot of theories about this, but these programs don't have any real accountability for results. The private schools, they get the money, but if they have to have the kids take the tests, they don't get reported, or at least they don't get reported in the same way as for traditional public schools. There's not really a threat that they're going to lose the ability to get that publicly funded money. And so, again, what we see is 2 systems of school choice: charter schools, vouchers. Charters have accountability, vouchers don't. The charter schools perform better, right? And I think, in my view, it's quite clear that the accountability piece is why that is, okay? Oh, and then finally, a great new study from Chile that showed promising results for accountability. Susana Claro and her colleagues studied schools that were just barely rated insufficient compared to those that just barely missed that cut, okay? So really good design, and found improvements in academics and in the social and emotional skills that you measure in the schools facing that lowest rating. So that just getting that low rating, even though you haven't yet actually closed those schools, but just that threat seemed to do something to boost outcomes, both test scores and social and emotional. So, again, a ton of evidence that this accountability works. Okay, now, like I said earlier, part of the promise is that, hey, educators, if we hold you accountable for results, we're going to give you more freedom so that you can be the professionals that you are. And you can go into the classroom and you can use your own professional judgment and don't have to be micromanaged, don't have to spend all your time around compliance and paperwork and following rules and regulations. Now, to be honest, we have not made good on that promise in the United States. Our traditional public schools remain quite regulated, right? There's been some efforts over the years to try to pull back some of that regulation, but it has not been successful. So in a lot of those traditional public schools, there's some accountability, but there's still not a ton of freedom of action, okay? Now, in charter schools, we've done better, and there is more autonomy, and again, I think that's part of why they might outperform. You know, people are just more motivated when you get to go in and act like a professional, and you don't just have to do what somebody above you tells you to do all the time, right? But I also want to say, you know, that we've learned an important lesson in the United States, which is that it's not enough just to have accountability and autonomy, okay? Again, back to this idea that there's places where the issue is not just will, but skill, that we also have to make sure that we are providing support and capacity and skill building to schools as well, okay? And, you know, it seems like such an obvious thing, but we really missed it in No Child Left Behind. We really had a lot of these places where teachers felt all this pressure and didn't know what to do, where school principals felt a lot of pressure and didn't know what to do. And so they then resorted to doing some really bad things, okay? They really did narrow the curriculum. They really did resort to teaching to the test. We even had a cheating scandal, you know, where there was a ring of teachers and principals who were going in and you know, erasing kids' answers and filling in the right answers because they felt so much pressure and didn't know what else to do, right? The prosecutor who prosecuted that cheating scandal in Atlanta is the same prosecutor that's now prosecuting Donald Trump. Interesting. But, you know, this is the sort of thing that happens when you put pressure on a system and don't also invest in helping improve the knowledge and skills and capacity of the system, okay? Now, in the United States, we are finally working to fix this. There's been a big effort in the last 10 years to try to provide more help. It helps that we now have these common standards called the Common Core Standards. We had a big fight over that also, but they're still in place in most places. And that has allowed us now to finally have some curriculum that are in place all over the country. So not a national curriculum, but some curriculum offerings that are pretty widespread. That in turn allows us to do a lot more training around their specific curriculum. And that seems to be really making a difference, at least in some states. You may have been reading about Mississippi, one of our poorest states, where we've had this huge progress in reading. They've come in using much better materials, a lot more training. It's having a big impact, okay? So again, trying to free up schools, that's a worthy effort, okay? But it can't come at the expense of providing help and expertise, okay? You gotta do both. You gotta do both because there's a lot of places out there where they wanna do well. That's probably most of us. We wanna do well in our jobs. We wanna go in and teachers wanna help kids learn, but they may not know how to do it. They may not know which curriculum materials to use. They may not have the training that they need. So we gotta do both and, okay? All right, we're rounding the bend here, people. We're almost there, okay? Last topic. There are some legitimate concerns around testing and accountability, no doubt, right? I mean, I think nobody really wants to be held accountable, right? So, you know, and to some degree, when educators complain about accountability, we just have to say, look, you work in a public system. It's only fair. We're talking about taxpayer dollars. We're talking about our country's and our kids' futures. There's going to have to be accountability, right? But the specifics matter, and if it's not done well, there are legitimate concerns, okay? The teaching to the test. This notion that if you have bad tests, you're going to encourage bad teaching, okay? In America, in the early days of No Child Left Behind, a real worry about schools just getting rid of everything but math and reading. And there was some evidence that happened, okay? That we taught less science and history than we had before. It wasn't huge. These were small differences over time, okay? More time for reading, more time for math. But it was indicative of the mindset. And it was, again, a huge mistake. It turns out, tons of evidence recently that if you want kids to make progress in reading, especially, yes, you have to teach them phonics, decoding, how to spell out the letters, right? But once they know that, what really matters is they need to have knowledge about the world. They need to have vocabulary. They need to have reading comprehension. You'd get that by teaching history, by teaching science. Do it as early as possible when kids love learning about faraway times and places. So the worst thing you can do is to stop teaching history and stop teaching science. And yet that's what happened, because we didn't test those subjects, right? So that was a legitimate issue, right? All this, so this worry, back in the No Child Left Behind days, that the way the testing worked, we were just looking at how many kids were getting to the proficient level. And so over time, schools learned that if they wanted to look good, they could just focus on the kids that were just below proficiency. We started calling these the bubble kids, right? Ignore the kids that are the lowest performing, who had no shot at making it there. Ignore the kids who are the high performing, who are, already above that line on the first day of school. Just focus on the bubble kids, or on the bubble schools, right? That the schools that were most at risk of getting these negative ratings, that's where we saw the biggest progress. Okay, now, the way that you solve this, we have learned, is you've really got to look at progress over time. You can't just look at how many kids are passing the test. Okay, evidence from this from Ohio, where we do a lot of work. What we find is that if you just look at achievement, okay, which is basically how many kids pass the test or pass the test at different levels, I think a little bit like you do here. Okay, you get more points for passing at a higher level. Very strongly correlated with socioeconomic background, right? Again, we know poor kids tend to come in way behind. Not surprisingly, they don't do well in these tests, okay? I know you try to control for that, right? But look at on this other measure. When we look at value added, okay, this measure of student progress, which is how much does a kid learn from one year to the next, there's virtually no relationship with socioeconomic background. We don't even have to control for the socioeconomic factors, okay? And what it means for schools, it's hugely important, because suddenly you can be a school that serves all kids coming from poverty, a high poverty school, and you can get an A rating, because even if those kids are starting out way behind, if you help them make a lot of progress every year, you get credit for that, right? Especially if you've got tests that are sensitive enough to really find out where they're performing, right? And be able to detect that progress that they're making from one year to the next. Now, they may still have a long way to go to get where they need to be in order to meet those achievement levels and to be able to go on and succeed in college and all the rest. But this is what educators have control over. They don't have control over where kids are when they get them, right? And when they get them, there's already huge disparities between rich and poor, right? What they do have control over is progress from one year to the next. So I would say, if there was one thing that you want to fix or improve on in your education system, it would be a much greater focus on this progress. I understand there's a little bit in your system, but in my view, it should be the major focus. One way to do this, in Texas, their accountability system, here's what they say. They say, okay, we're going to have two grades. One is for achievement, how many kids are passing the test. One is for progress, okay? And we'll grade you on both. And then the grade you actually get as a school is whichever is highest. Okay, so if you're a rich school in the suburbs of Dallas, okay, and all your kids are coming from well-educated families, okay, and your kids come in and they score super high, they get an A. They get an A for achievement. They may not make much progress from year to year. It's hard to make progress for kids who are already scoring at high levels, but that doesn't matter. That grade doesn't matter. You get an A. And if you're a school in inner city Houston, where everybody is poor, everybody is black, they all come in with very low test scores, but you're making a lot of progress from one year to the next, okay, like the KIPP schools that are famous there, IDEA schools, you get an A for progress. And you ignore whatever your achievement grade is. That doesn't count. Okay, so both the affluent suburban school and the inner city school can both get A's, right? To me, that's a really great system, because it encourages educators to shoot for this, and it's a sense of fairness. Now, if you're doing poorly at achievement and progress, right? Kids are coming in behind and they're not making much progress over time, okay, that school deserves the lowest rating, okay, an F. And there needs to be something done about that school. I think that's something that you might learn from. Whew, all right, so, bottom line here, again, tests don't measure everything, okay? But they do measure skills that really matter. And accountability and measurement and classification doesn't do everything. It really doesn't. You really got to pay attention to the help and the capacity building, the funding, everything else that we worry about. But it's definitely a net plus, okay? And so I do hope as you go and continue this work, especially in the wake of the terrible pandemic, that you commit to maintaining this system that you've built, this very good system, maybe improving it even further, maybe a greater focus on progress over time, and keep the progress going in that direction. And then just to say, at the end of the day, the most important kind of accountability for all of us in education is to hold one another accountable. Right? When you go into a great school, that's what's happening, right? It's the professionals, whether they're the principals and the teachers, they're holding one another accountable for giving their best every day, okay? And it's that, when you get to that point, that we really see good things happening for kids. Thank you, and I look forward to taking some questions.
How are you feeling?
Woo, good. Yeah. This is good. I got to get some stamina back here. This is like running a marathon. This is good. Yeah.
And we had lots of people in spite of the rain.
Yeah, wonderful. What a great turnout. It's fantastic.
I'm going to switch into Spanish.
Okay, good. Oh, should I get my...
¿Necesitas un...?
Okay. Oh, great. Yeah.
You let me know.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
Bueno, hay un montón de preguntas, pero cuando uno oye esta presentación, uno dice, no estamos tan mal, no estamos tan lejos, nos hemos acercado a políticas públicas que van en esta dirección. Yo pensaba que el No Child Left Behind duró algo así como 13 años y Every Child Succeeds, que desde el 2015 lleva aproximadamente 7, 8 años. Las políticas públicas en Chile cambian cíclicamente con los cambios políticos. ¿Qué peso tiene el tener políticas públicas permanentes en el tiempo o de largo aliento? ¿Cuánto ayuda eso a que se establezca una mayor riqueza en el sistema?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, we sometimes feel like the fact that we haven't been able to change these laws very quickly is a problem, right? We have, as you probably know, our politics are crazy. Our Congress can't get much done. It's impossible to pass laws. So as a result, these things stay in place a long time. No Child Left Behind was only supposed to last 6 years. It lasted 13. But like you indicate, there's some real plus side of that. I mean, a lot of these reforms, they do take time. And I think in education, we have a habit of not being patient enough. And just when things are starting to have traction, we move on to the next, right? And of course, in education, it's a slow process. And kids are in our schools for 13, 14 years, and it takes a while to see that. Now, we have to balance that also, though, with a sense of urgency. And so I think that's the trick, is to say, all right, you know, maybe we want to keep a policy framework in place for a while, but we need to see that there's progress happening every year and that there's, you know, a sense that, you know, for these kids, we only have one shot. And especially after this pandemic, I am very worried that we're not anywhere acting fast enough to help these kids, you know, that they're so far behind, and especially the older kids are going to just end up leaving our schools without ever having a chance to learn as much as they would have. So we've got to balance urgency and patience.
Hay otra cosa en nuestro sistema que genera, por así decirlo, algunas diferencias. Nuestro currículum está como siempre amenazado de tener que ser cambiado, ya sea porque los profesores sienten que es muy pesado, a pesar de que fue hecho con un benchmark de muchísimos países que tenían la misma cantidad de contenidos y habilidades en el currículum. Nuestros profesores sintieron de que era imposible cubrir el currículum. Durante la pandemia se hizo una optimización y se consideraron ciertos contenidos del currículum como prioritarios. Ahora estamos tratando de volver a un currículum estable y hay una brecha por conseguir. ¿Qué es mejor para un país o qué ha demostrado ser mejor país? Tener algo como los Common Core Standards, en los cuales los alumnos pueden llegar a ellos a través de distintos currículum, o tener un currículum nacional.
Yeah, you know, a national curriculum in the United States has always been a non-starter, right? And partly because we're huge, because of the politics, because of our system of government. But look, I think having not a national, a few, makes a lot of sense. I mean, it's crazy that we've had a system in a lot of places where we just tell teachers to just go figure it out, you know? Here are the standards, and you figure out how to reach them. I mean, you know, I think we did that because we thought that's what it meant to be professionals, or that's what it meant to respect educators. But at least in the United States, what teachers tell us is, no, like, I want to have a resource. I want it to be built by teachers. I want the curriculum to be built by teachers. But if it's a good curriculum, then yeah, I want that as a resource. Now, I may, you know, if I'm a great teacher, I'm going to make some changes here or there. You know, maybe the new teacher sticks to it pretty closely. The great veteran teacher, you know, can do more. But you need to have that framework. This one about, you know, about priority topics, we had a similar effort in a lot of places in the United States. I think that made sense during the pandemic. I think it also makes sense to now try to get back. And it's also legitimate. My understanding is that there are some grade levels where there's probably too much in the Chilean curriculum to cover. So there's got to be some way where you have feedback from teachers that's legitimate, and that's, you say, hey, this is a problem, and you can make changes. You know, since it's now with technology, you know, we don't all need to have these printed textbooks. I mean, we should be able to, you know, make some changes as we go. Again, balancing the urgency with the patience.
Te referiste, Mike, a los soportes que recibían los colegios charter y que de alguna manera los diferenciaba de los public schools en Estados Unidos. ¿Podrías referirte más en profundidad a qué tipo de soporte, más allá de financiamiento, pueden recibir? ¿Es acompañamiento o supervisión?
Yeah, well, first of all, let me clarify. I mean, I think the major reason the charter schools are performing better is because of the accountability, right? They know that they can be shut down if they don't improve, and that pressure, I think, gets them to do things that are hard. Like, if they hire a teacher and she turns out not to be very good, to, you know, to fire her. That happens a lot more in charter schools than it does in traditional public schools. The fact that they don't have a union gives them that kind of flexibility to be able to do more of that. I think that's a big factor. It is also true that our best charter schools tend to be those that are part of a network, like these famous ones you might have heard of, like KIPP, IDEA, Uncommon Schools. And those networks do provide a lot of support. You know, they do tend to have, especially recently, a curriculum that everybody uses. They have really good training that goes to the teachers. They don't leave it to individual teachers. They don't even leave it to individual schools. You know, they now might have, you know, in KIPP's case, they have 100 schools. In some of these others, it's 20 or 30 or 40. And they're able to build expertise among the whole network. And just, again, constantly try to learn about how to do things better and keep making refinements to their model. And I think that has worked well. Some of our school districts for traditional public schools have tried to do that. And there's some that are well respected and that have gotten better results also when they put in that kind of effort. But I think it's, you know, partly because of our political system, it's just harder. You know, in the public system, we tend to have leadership changing more often. Superintendents get fired. There's a great superintendent right now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, who was fired last night because she was in a fight with the state superintendent over wokeness and, you know, books. She's a friend of mine. She's fantastic. I don't know why, you know, but this sort of thing keeps happening. It doesn't tend to happen as much in charter schools.
Eso es interesante. La rotación produce la rotación de personas en cargos de liderazgo produce un efecto más negativo. ¿Qué tipo de incentivos reciben los buenos profesores? ¿Cómo un buen profesor siente que efectivamente está siendo considerado y valorado, y qué efecto espejo tiene eso en profesores que podrían distinguir claramente cuáles son esos reconocimientos?
Yeah, you know, we've tried a lot of things over the years. About 10 years ago, there was a big push to try to recognize great teachers by paying them more. And it worked in a few places. You really had to pay a lot more. We would say, okay, if you're a great teacher and you're teaching in a rich school, we want to pay you a lot more so that you'll come over here and teach in a poor school. And it worked if you got to pay them a lot more. And it tended to work if you had to take a big group of teachers, not just one, but 10, you know, and have a cohort. Again, I think that part of it is this psychology. Teachers want to be successful. They want to be around other great teachers. They want to have a culture and a community. And if you can build that, then that's really important. I think in our charter sector, you have a healthy dynamic where some of our best teachers, there's a clear way for them to go on and start their own charter school. And that's something a lot of them want to do. And so they can keep growing. So, you know, maybe after 10 years in the classroom, they're ready for a new challenge, they can take that next step and start this, you know, school of their dreams. There's just less of that happening in the traditional public schools. You know, in our system, in the traditional public schools, we expect teachers to come in and do the same job for 30 years. And they often stay because there's a big payoff in terms of the pension if they stay the whole time. And so, you know, sometimes you have teachers who will say, look, I'm just tired, I'm burned out after 20 years, but they can't leave. It's just leaving way too much money on the table with the pension, so they stay, even though they don't really want to. Charter schools, you know, we tend to have people staying less time, but they tend to be more motivated while they're there. And pros and cons.
Pregunta, dentro de los colegios, de los charter schools, para nosotros colegios particulares subvencionados, ¿se admite, existe algún tipo de aporte por parte de los padres al colegio, de manera que ya sea contraten a un profesor de chino como extracurricular, o ya sea para tener mayor cantidad de deporte? ¿Existe esa posibilidad? ¿Son los charter schools libres de aceptar pago por parte de los padres?
Interesting. No.
No.
Basically, no. Though, you know, all of our schools, including the traditional public schools, do some fundraising from parents. And so we'll call parent-teacher associations, PTAs. And in a lot of places, there's rules about what that money can be spent on. Usually, it's got to be for fun, extra things, you know, parties, but sometimes it does go towards things like computers in the classroom or technology, and we've had a debate because, not surprisingly, the schools in the rich areas can raise a lot more money than schools in poor areas. So, like in the school district where I live, there's a rule that you have to take half the money that you raise at a rich school and give it to a poor school, you know, to try to make it fair. I think there's actually more of that going on in traditional public schools than in charter schools. And part of that is that our charter schools tend to be in poor areas. And I think those schools don't tend to ask parents to pay.
La política de No Child Left Behind, que ya sabemos duró 13 años, básicamente porque no hubo nuevas innovaciones por parte del Congreso en apoyar nuevas fórmulas. En definitiva, ¿cuáles fueron sus mayores críticas? ¿Qué críticas se pueden levantar a esa política?
Yeah, you know, it was the ones that I ran through. I would say this worry about teaching to the test was a big one. And I think what was behind that was that way back then, the tests that we used were not very good. I mean, they really were the kind of tests where if you did had kids just practice tests, practice tests, practice tests, fill in the blank, memorize, you would get better scores. And so it really did encourage teachers to adapt instructional practices that were not very good. And so that was a major issue. And we have made some progress on that. The tests, the assessments we use now are higher quality. And so it's more the case now that if you want to get better test scores, you've got to teach well. You've got to teach higher order skills. You know, with mathematics, you've got to do more problem solving, you know, not just the memorization. So I think that's been, but, you know, you can understand that teachers were feeling like, you're telling me to do things that I think are bad for kids, and they were right. And then this concern about just looking at test scores one time. We got to a point where almost every school in a poor neighborhood in America got the lowest rating. That said, all of these schools are failing. And it was crazy. Even schools that we knew, again, like some of the famous ones, the KIPS and the, you know, some schools, great schools in urban areas that we knew were helping kids make a lot of progress, but the way the system worked, they didn't get credit for that. And so that was incredibly demoralizing. And so we knew it needed to change. Couldn't get the law passed through Congress, though eventually, especially President Obama and his education secretary were able to make some changes through regulation to address that.
¿Qué cambios reales se ven? I'm sorry. Ahí. ¿Qué cambios reales hoy día están en la discusión, ya que post pandemia tanto los alumnos como los profesores adquirieron herramientas computacionales, tecnológicas, accedieron a una mayor cantidad de plataformas para el aprendizaje? ¿Cómo se está considerando todo lo que es hoy día el aprendizaje adaptativo a través de plataformas que de alguna manera se aleja del colegio por cuanto puede ser un aprendizaje individual y no estaría necesariamente necesitando la estructura escolar? ¿Qué inquietudes hay al respecto?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. You know, I think, like in so many things, we're going from one extreme to the other. There's a belief that online learning was a complete disaster in the United States. And there's good reason for that. I mean, we can see quite clearly that the schools that stayed closed the longest to in-person learning, where kids were learning online, those kids lost the most amount of learning, that the learning loss, as we call it. They tended to be schools that were in poor areas. Those tended to be places where the unions are strongest, and so they stayed closed the longest. And schools that were able to get back in person sooner, they didn't lose as much time. And so there's a perception that online learning just does not work, right? That kids need to be there to learn. Now, I think that's going to an extreme that's too far, right? I mean, I think the story is more complicated. I think that it's the case that the way we did online learning wasn't very effective in most places. Not surprisingly. I mean, this was a pandemic, right? And like here, overnight, all of a sudden, teachers had to figure out how to try to do this. We made a lot of mistakes, you know. Kids got bored. They turned off their screens. You know, so I think in some ways it's a shame because I do think there's promise of using these technologies in some effective ways. I think we know, for example, that the kids who are most motivated, who tend to be your high-achieving kids, can do quite well a lot of times in these kinds of environments. You know, they've got the drive. And if you can use some of these online learning platforms to let them just keep going, you know, rather than sit there bored while their classmates are kind of catching up, just set them free to keep on, you know, take classes from colleges, you know, there's a lot of exciting things you could do there. I think you could even figure out some interesting high school models where maybe you don't need kids to come to class every day, and it could be more like college where, you know, you do, you know, you come to class less often, but you do more homework. Or you could do some interesting things. But that's not the discussion right now. The discussion right now is this was a huge failure, and we just need to get kids back in school.
Se refirió Mike varias veces a la familia. Me encantaría que nos diga cuál es el rol de la familia en el sistema. ¿Cuánta libertad tienen las familias para escoger el colegio para sus hijos? ¿Cuánta libertad tienen para ser parte de lo que pasa adentro del colegio? Ser socios del sistema.
Yeah, you know, we are catching up to what you've had here in Chile for a long time. And I would say that in our cities now, in most cities in America, there's a lot of choice, and it would look alike. And parents, and we've gotten better at, you know, the details, good information, helping with transportation. But once parents have chosen a school, I think there's not as much going on in terms of that kind of partnership. I mean, you see it in some places, especially in the more affluent areas, where, you know, parents maybe have more time, where maybe they've got more money, obviously, but they have more time to volunteer, and they have. I think in the poorest areas, I think a lot of those schools recognize that their parents are working very hard, sometimes 2 jobs, and so they don't feel comfortable asking them to do too much. You know, they sometimes just say, hey, you know, give us your kids, get them here on time, make sure they get a good night's sleep, you know, make sure that they do their homework, and then we'll take it from here. That's not the case. There's some schools that are more interested in that partnership, but I think they try to balance it without putting unrealistic expectations on parents too.
Luego me preguntan cómo se componen o de qué se componen los equipos que acompañan desde cada distrito a los public schools. Ya hablamos de que los colegios particulares subvencionados tenían redes de apoyo tanto dentro de sus propios colegios como con otros. En los public schools, ¿de dónde viene la ayuda? ¿Viene de una agencia estatal? ¿Y quién compone esa agencia estatal? ¿Se compone de visitas a los colegios físicamente, digamos? ¿Van a verlo y les hacen seguimiento? ¿O me cortaron?
Yeah, no, I would say we haven't done this very well. You know, and in America, you know, we've got the federal government, and then the states, and then school districts, and then the school. And in most places, they expect the school district to do a lot of that support. And sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. A few states, especially some of our smaller states like Massachusetts, have tried to do more of it, where they do send in teams and send in support, and that's been helpful. But I understand that you've looked a lot to the United Kingdom, to Ofsted, to that model with, you know, inspectors really going in, or, you know, we really haven't done too much of that. And I think it shows. I mean, I think that we need a lot more of that, because I think if you ask the typical teacher or principal in America, do you get much support, they would say no.
En Chile, si bien es cierto, miramos muy profundamente el modelo Ofsted. Hay un giro, porque desde siempre se pensó que la Agencia de la Calidad de la Educación iba a acompañar a los colegios más debilitados, a acompañarlos en su proceso de mejora, más que a supervisar o fiscalizar. En Chile tenemos una superintendencia que fiscaliza que tanto los recursos como la infraestructura estén bien. La agencia solamente ve la parte pedagógica del sistema. Me dicen que me pasé en el tiempo, pero creo que la conversación lo meritaba. 1.000.000 de gracias, Mike, por la disposición a conversar.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.